Shalom, I am Naama Rue. My husband, Rabbi David Rue, is going to continue teaching us today about harvesting of holy sanctity food during the Shmita year, which is grown in the 7th year of the 7-year cycle. And because the land is resting this year and it all belongs to God, so we have to treat the food, the produce and the plants and the land very differently, and doing things with like I learned in our last video about you can harvest, but you have to use a shinui, like do it differently, for example. But there were various opinions that were being shared, and now we're going to delve into those some more, right?
Well, we're going to review them so that we can get some solidity in understanding it. Now, there are two types of land, shamor and mufkar. Shamor land is land that's guarded, locked up, not accessible to everyone. Hefker land is ownerless land that is accessible to everyone. All right, so the Rambam says that if you're harvesting fruit from a place that is shamor, that is locked up, you can only harvest it with a shinui. You have to harvest it in an abnormal way. And we'll talk about what a shinui would be toward the end. And if you're talking about hefker land, the Rambam also says that you have to harvest it with a shinui. So the Rambam really doesn't care. If you're harvesting any food on the Shmita, you have to do it in an abnormal way. The Ramban says in terms of shamor, guarded land, that you have to harvest it with a shinui. He says in terms of hefker land that there's a rabbinic obligation for a shinui. But from Torah law, you could harvest it in the normal way.
Hefker means public space. Ownerless land. Mm-hmm.
The Rash says in terms of shamor, guarded private property, it's only mutter with a shinui. And if it's hefker, then it's mutter even without any type of shinui. You can harvest it in the normal way. Rabbeinu Tam says if it's shamor, and this is the only opinion I ever expressed in Tosfos, that it's asur to harvest, period. I don't care what.
Can you say that in English?
If the land is locked up, shamor, then it's prohibited to harvest anything from it, period.
Because someone's claiming ownership?
Or you're acting as if it's owned. I don't care whether you're claiming ownership. You could say, this is known, but I put a lock on my gate, so no one can come in. Obviously, I'm guarding it. I'm protecting. It doesn't matter what you say. It matters
Those
what you
people
do.
can also make the produce available in a different way.
Well, we're not there yet.
Okay.
And Rabbeinu Tam says, for harvesting from hefker, from ownerless, opened things, it's only permitted with a shinui. So, in a quick summary of this, if we were looking at a different way, if we're talking about shamor, guarded produce, an area that's guarded, Rambam, Ramban, and the Rash all say it's permitted to harvest with a shinui, and Rabbeinu Tam says you're not allowed to harvest at all. If you're talking about things that are ownerless, public ownerless land, the Rambam and Rabbeinu Tam say that you have to use a shinui. You have to harvest it in an abnormal way from Torah law. The Ramban says by rabbinic law you have to harvest it with a shinui. And the Rash says you don't have to harvest it with a shinui at all. All right. Where did we get this from? It all comes from the Bryce and Torah Kehnim, or the Gemara, which is almost identical in the Yerushalmi, where it says that it's asur lebtzor mina shamor ela mina mufkar. The first part of the brisa, there are two parts of the brisa. The first part says you're not allowed to harvest from guarded land, only from ownerless land. And the second part of the brisa says asur lebtzor kederech habוצרים. You're not allowed to harvest in the normal way, and without quoting the exact thing, it gives examples of shinui, but we're going to say that you can only harvest the shinui. So how is this understood? According to the Rambam, he understands the first part of the brisa, that it's prohibited to harvest from guarded land only from unguarded land, that you should not be harvesting from guarded land, only from unguarded land. And the Rambam says in the second part that of the Brisa, which he holds is the halachic part of the Brisa, that wherever you're harvesting, whether it's from guarded land or unguarded land, you can only harvest with a shinui, with a change. The Rash and the Rambam learn almost identically. So for the first part of the Brisa, everyone learns the same way, that you're not allowed to harvest from guarded land, you're only allowed to harvest from unguarded land. And they say that to be able to harvest from guarded land, you have to use a shinui. The Rambam says this is the rabbanan, the Rosh says this is deraisa. And of course, then from unguarded land, you don't need to do anything. Rabbeinu Tam says, from the first part of the Brisa, if the land was guarded, protected, locked in some way, then you're never allowed to harvest from it. And from the second part of the Brisa, he says, in public land, you're only allowed to harvest with a shinui. So what does this mean? What would be a shinui? There are crops that are normally picked by hand. You don't use any type of kli to harvest them. So if you're harvesting during the Shmita year, you could use scissors or a clipper or something like that to harvest them, but you couldn't be allowed to harvest them by hand because that's the normal way of harvesting. If there's something that you normally use a clipper to harvest, you could harvest it with a knife, for instance, which wouldn't be a clipper, or you could harvest it by hand, if that's physically possible, but you couldn't harvest it in the normal way.
Scissors and clipper are different. So if you have a tool like a clipper you usually use, maybe you bring a scissor.
I don't know if a scissor is that different. I mean, it's two blades coming together. They're both two blades coming together. That's why I say a knife would definitely work. And I mean, I don't suggest use a kitchen knife. There are other types of knives that could be used for such a thing. But the method of harvest has to be abnormal. Now, this helps us for all our home gardening. But if we would say that we have an entire field that we have to harvest, that וצריך is harvesting for the entire community, if we told the farmers they had to do it in an abnormal way, the workers, the field would never get harvested. It wouldn't happen. So the fact that it's וצריך, which is clearly from the language of the Tosefta that describes the וצריך, they are allowed to do things that normally would be prohibited. And if you put that together with the Rash's opinion that you can harvest from hefker land, which וצריך is harvesting from, without any shinui at all, so then it seems reasonable for the וצריך to harvest in this way, and this is in fact what they do. They harvest in the normal way. Now, because it's in a large quantity, and that's the only way to get it done? Because it's being done by the community. The Beis Din of וצריך represents the entire community of Klal Yisrael. So it's bringing for all of Klal Yisrael into the city. And if you put that together with the opinion of the Rash, that you don't require any shinui at all, any change at all, to harvest on hefker land, on ownerless land, then it's reasonable to say that they can harvest in the normal way. Okay.
But I'm not going to do that at home.
You can't. I mean, by definition, you can't. You can't do it at home unless your home happens to be.
So I should put away my clippers
600 dunim or something like that. Well, you could use clippers for something that you normally harvest by hand, right?
Like basically, I'm going to be pinching off the rest of my basil.
However it is, I don't know how these things are harvested, but whatever is the normal way, you have to use something that's significantly different. For instance, if I have a clipper, I have several clippers, one of this size and one of that size. Obviously, changing from clipper to clipper wouldn't be a shinui. It's not. You're not really changing the way you're doing it. It has to be a change in the actual process.
So, like in Israel, we call it basilico, right? So, like I usually use my clippers because it's easier, but I can just use my hands.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also, it's the end of the season.
And for many things, like tomatoes are generally harvested by hand, right? You would have to harvest
just clip off the section, especially
clip
end of
it
the
off
season.
at the end. Yeah, something like that. I mean, this is what you have to do. You have to do. So this is what we have to know about harvesting at this point. And it's good to review the opinions and get them clear in your mind. There are a couple charts below in the YouTube thing, if you press see more, which should help you remember what the opinions on this are.